Good morning, GTS retail partners, and welcome to our Monday edition of the GTS Retailer to Publisher webinar series. I'm Scott Bohr, your category manager here at GTS for gaming specialty products, which includes role-playing games, miniatures, and gaming accessories like dice and all those fun things that accentuate your gaming experience. And today we're going to be joined by Joe Goodman of Goodman Games. Just real briefly, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can interact with our hosts and our presenter this morning by checking out the chat window down at the bottom. If you hover over your screen, you'll see the chat button appear down at the bottom of the screen. You click that and you'll have the option of sending your message either to all panelists, which is Joe and myself, or all panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see the question that you're asking. We will have some time for questions, so go ahead and enter any questions you might have into the chat window as the presentation proceeds, and then if it's time to interrupt it, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll take questions at the end. And then if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit like and subscribe so you can be sure to be notified of future webinars. And if you'd like to sign up, if you're a retailer and would like to sign up for getting notifications of the webinars to attend live, go ahead and click that link in the description, and you'll be all set up for that. We're very pleased today to welcome Joe Goodman of Goodman Games to talk about Dungeon Crawl Classics 5th Edition Adventures Original Adventures Reincarnated, and all the other great products coming from Goodman Games. So without further ado, I want to hand things over to Joe and take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Goodman. Nice to meet you or virtually meet you. First, I should give you a little bit of fair warning that I'm working from home, as are a lot of people these days. So over the course of the next half hour, you may meet my wife, my kids, my dog, my father-in-law, or even the neighbors. So we'll do as best as we can to kind of keep this contained, but there's only so much I can do to keep them out of this room. But anyway, greetings to everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm going to talk a little bit about just some current releases and projects we're working on and things like that. Any questions are welcome. Feel free to chat them or ask them however we can, and I'll do my best to answer them. If we run out of time, I'm happy to take questions by email afterwards. So I'm going to start by discussing one of our current releases, which is Castle Amber. This is part of what we call the OR series, OAR, Original Adventures Reincarnated, and the little logos on the back. And we have an arrangement with Wizards of the Coast where we take some of the classic D&D modules, and you can see the D&D logo there, and convert them to 5th edition. So this is this week, getting it mini now, and I'm just going to talk about it a little bit, tell you a little bit about what the series has done for us. It's actually done extremely well. Oh, thanks, Scott. Scott's broadcasting this cube. I mean, many of you probably have Into the Borderlands, which was the first release in this series, where we took one of the most popular D&D modules ever and converted it to 5th edition. And the second volume was the Isle of Dread, where we did the same with the Isle of Dread. And of course, that's shipped with the Expert box set for D&D way back when, you know, sold a gazillion copies because it shipped with every box set of D&D. So both of those were extremely popular and I think very logical choices for, you know, for what you would want to have in a series like this. Many people have asked me, why did we do Castle Amber? Now, this is number 5 in the series, so there's been quite a few, but why would we pick Castle Amber? This is definitely not one of the best sellers in the D&D series. And it was definitely one of the, I guess, more, you know, esoteric picks within the line. But the answer to why we did it goes back to Appendix N. And if there are some of you out there who are either old school D&D fans or fans of Dungeon Crawl Classics or some of the other stuff Goodman Games has done, you may know Appendix N. When Gary Gygax was writing D&D, he actually read a ton of great fantasy and in some cases science fiction books and produced a list called Appendix N. And it's called that because in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the original AD&D DMG, it was, you know, Appendix N after appendixes L, M, N, O, P, etc. And that was his list of all the books that essentially inspired him to write D&D. And he included some comics in there and some movies as well. But one of the most notorious omissions from Appendix N is Clark Ashton Smith, who is considered by many to be one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time. He, along with Robert E. Howard, who created Conan, and H.P. Lovecraft, who created Cthulhu, those 3 writers were the core of Weird Tales magazine back in the 1930s. And Weird Tales is a magazine that essentially spawned modern fantasy as we know it. And we're talking about some 80 to 90 years ago was its peak. But Clark Ashton Smith was an extraordinary writer. He's actually from California, from Auburn, California, a little bit north of here. And he wrote just fantastic fiction. And his fiction not only influenced Gary Gygax, and a lot of people think that he was actually left out of Appendix N as a mistake, but it also influenced many, many other TSR creators, developers, including the person who wrote Castle Amber. So Tom Moldvay, who would write Castle Amber, he, I'm flipping open to show you some pages. He actually, I can't see the words, it's not gonna help you to see it all. Tom Moldvay actually read most of Clark Ashton Smith's, a certain fiction cycle he had. And if you go back and reread those stories and then reread Castle Amber, you can find the places where Moldvay directly, essentially lifted elements from Clark Ashton Smith's fiction. Now, it was done with good intent. It was actually in collaboration with the estate of Clark Ashton Smith. So it wasn't officially licensed or anything, but it was all, you know, part of this sort of collaborative spirit that happened in those early days of D&D. And so what we've done as part of this series is, with every book in this series, we go back and we interview some of the original creators. We research some of what was happening at TSR at the time. We document some of the history on the reprints, because TSR would reprint these modules and, you know, change the art inside with every reprint. But in this one in particular, we have a profile of Clark Ashton Smith. And he's a terrific writer, and you learn a lot about him. And then we have a section in here where we actually discuss all the direct inspirations, so sources of Castle Amber, back these D&D and to the specific stories and the issues of Weird Tales that they were published in back in the 1930s. And it's very interesting to see how what we think of as D&D as sort of freshly formed in the 1970s actually has a lineage that goes back decades before that to some of the, you know, fundamental foundations of fantasy literature. And then of course you get into the fun part, which is D&D Adventures. So in this series, what we do is that we reprint the original work. So you'll have in here a direct reprint of the original D&D module in its first edition form. So, you know, all the original first edition art straight out of what was published back in this case, I think 1982, if my memory serves. And then you have a 5e conversion. So the majority of the page count in the book is actually the 5e conversion, because we not only take the original 1e and convert it to 5e stats, and, you know, those are a little bigger, but we also typically add in new content. Then something else fun that we've done in this one is we've added in a couple of gatefolds. So there's a couple sections where you can fold it open to see full scale maps. One of the things we do at Goodman Games is we take pride in hand illustrating everything. So there's very little, actually really, there's almost no digital art in our books. It's an aesthetic that people, well, they'll often comment on how our titles resemble a lot of the original, you know, original stuff from the 80s that they remember. And it's hard for a lot of people to pin down exactly why. But I'll tell you the why. The why is that instead of using digital tools to produce art, instead of using Photoshop or Illustrator, we work with artists who actually get out pen and paper and draw a picture on paper and then scan it. And while that may seem really obvious, it's actually extremely rare these days. Very few art schools teach those techniques. Very few art schools teach those techniques anymore. Almost all the teaching now happens in digital media. So when the artists we work with illustrate something and finish, there's what I call a physical artifact left behind. There's you know, paper and pencil, or paper and pen, or board and art, or canvas and art, or something left behind. And that's what creates this amazing look and feel to the illustrations that seem so authentic to the past. That's also what allows us to do these amazing maps, which is part of the reason we're able to get these gatefolds, because these maps, which are hand illustrated, you know, which seems all the more amazing, are in part so amazing looking because they are created using those vintage techniques. In this case, actually, we actually commissioned an all new double-sized painting for the end sheets, which was painted by hand. This is by Doug Kovacs, and then he actually discusses in here how he painted it, which again might seem obvious, but there are sketches and preliminaries and partial color paintings that go with this to get to that. And Doug in particular is a huge fan of Clark Ashton Smith. One of the other things we do is we hire artists who have actually read all the works that are relevant to the thing they're illustrating. So there's often details in there that if you're not a big fan, you may not recognize, but if you are a big fan, you'll clearly see all the references to the original art. So just to show you one more thing about this, and I see there's a question coming in the chat, so hold on just one sec. I've shown you the front. Here is the spine. This is a huge book. It's a $49.99 retail. It has the D&D logo, just a really attractive spine. And if you had the other books in the series right next to it, it really sort of stands out on your shelf. And it's the kind of book that'll do really well for you. Also, I should mention it has the cover art by Earl Otis, one of the classic TSR illustrators. So now there's a question in the chat about buying for Latin America, which I mean, as long as GTS wants to sell it to you, it's okay with me. I don't have any restrictions on my end, if that answers the question.
Yeah, That product line, I believe all of Impressions that carries Goodman Games is also available through Latin America.
Great. So I've talked a little bit about Castellamber. Obviously, it's 5e compatible, and the series has done quite well for us. Are there any other questions that want to come through the chat? I'll pause for just a minute before I move on to talk about some other things. Right.
Joe, I'm happy to moderate the chat for you, so you can focus on the presentation, and I'll take care of questions.
Cool. That sounds good. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Dungeon Crawl Classics. So Dungeon Crawl Classics is our flagship role-playing game. It's grounded in Appendix N, which I mentioned, and many people call it old school. I actually don't think of it that way. I think it's just a simpler, exciting version of D&D that captures a lot of the spirit of the Appendix N literature that created D&D. I'll assume for the moment that many of you have heard of, we call it DCC RPG, and I'll move on to talk about what's coming out for it and so on. Then I'll circle back at the end to talk about how to get started if you are new to it. But one of the most requested things for DCC has been dice. And for those of you, DCC uses all these standard polyhedrons, and then we incorporate what I call funky dice or weird dice or Zaki dice. So in addition to the D4 and the D6, the rules actually use a D5 and a D7. In addition to the D12 and the D20, we also use a D14 and what am I forgetting? A D24, a D30. We have a lot of interesting and unusual dice that, a D7 that work through the dice chain, so to speak. And these have always been available in some form or another by different manufacturers out there. If you were to shop this guy and this guy and this guy, you could get a set. Goodman Games has been producing complete dice runs for quite some time, but it's been more challenging than we thought, mostly because it's hard to get the molds made and so on. The good news is we have a new run of dice. So there are, let's see, I think it's 3 new dice sets that are actually on their way over. Should be available for you guys in about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on a few factors. So look for those soon. And these are, the labeling is very simple and easy, DCC dice. Each one has a monster associated with it. And when the customer buys tube, they get obviously the dice, but there's also an insert that comes out of the tube. And if they open that up, they have stats for a new monster, which is illustrated on the tube itself. So good news for you existing retailers out there who are, been waiting on dice for quite some time. We finally are running again, and there's more coming up soon. One of the questions we often get is how can retailers get support for having DCC titles in their stores? We have a program called the Road Crew, and the Road Crew is where we essentially incentivize and reward gamers who go out and run DCC games in local stores. Now, this year has been different because of COVID, so I'm going to tell you how the arrangement works, in general. Then we'll talk about some of the exceptions we've made this year. But the way it's worked in general is that gamers get progressively better and better supporting prizes as they run. So at game 1, you might get a bookmark or a pencil, things like that. In 2 or game 3, you might get something more impressive like a dice bag and so on. And people who make it through to games like 12, 13, 14 at the end of the year get a big brass belt buckle, which is specific to that year, and in some cases other prizes. I mean, we've had people for quite some time who have worked with a and run ongoing campaigns where they run a game every couple of weeks or once a month or whatever it is, and sort of rack up the swag as they go. And then we also have programs where we send out, and I should tell this for any retailer who's interested, we're happy to send you quick start rules for DCC or a stack of bookmarks or things like that, because we set aside a certain amount of the swag for the Road Crew to also go out to retailers. Now this year with COVID, it's been a little different. I guess 6 months ago, we told Road Crew gamers that we still support games they play online, but for purposes of in-store gaming, we had to limit it due to all the stuff that was going on, and we didn't want to be responsible for any kind of transmission. I think what we're now working towards is, now that the world is finding a way to be safe again and reopen in safe ways, for 2021, we'll reopen the Road Crew program to anybody who wants to game in stores. And for now, for those of you who have, I know every store is a little different, but many stores right now have some form of either a podcast or a Twitch cast or some sort of online gaming or something like that. We're happy to continue to support that with Road Crew appearances or simply sending you swag or whatever that might be. But I see Scott just sent out the chat link. So if you have any fans in your stores who are interested in DCC, and I should say this also applies to our 5e products. So there's also separate swag that has the 5e logos on it. Any interested fans, just pass them that link. It's very simple. They basically just order the swag. It's free. Order it through our online store, and they have to put in there a link to what game they played. We also have an events page on our website. So if you're part of the system, you submit your event and say, hey, I'm playing at Joe's game store on Wednesday night. Here's the link to his website. Here's the street address that appears on our events page. So people who are games can go on there and say, oh, that game, that store's near me. I'm going to go play at that store. And then they just go on and tell us, and that's how they get the swag. So hope that helps some of you guys who are interested in finding out how your local fans can be involved. Other stuff for DCC, you've got, let's see, I talked about the dice. Some other stuff coming up. Well, obviously Halloween is a week away. I hope you guys have figured out something for your neighborhoods. My neighborhood is still figuring itself out. We used to have this great downtown, all the businesses would trick or treat with the kids, but because of COVID, we can't do that. So we're figuring out what to do, but hopefully you guys are figuring out something cool. We have Dungeon Crawl Classics Horror, the Web of All Torment, which is coming out. Actually, sorry, I believe it's shipping now, as I recall. And this is part of our DCC Horror series. We basically release a DCC Horror Adventure. Let me get this image right for the screen. We release one a year, usually in October, the idea being that obviously it's appropriate for Halloween. I'm not going to spoil it because there's obviously, you can tell from the cover, there's some gruesome stuff going on, but it's compatible with the DCC system and it's perfect for gamers who want to, jump in and have a fun night of Halloween gaming and something horrific. One thing I should note about this for all you guys who might be new to our line, almost every adventure or publication from Goodman Games, if you buy it in print, you also get digital, and that applies to retailers as well. It's not just on our website. If you open up to the title page, see if the camera can capture this, you'll have a little box here with a unique digital code. So anybody who buys it in your store can go to drivethroughrpg.com, key in that code, and then they'll get the digital download. You don't have to do anything as a retailer, it's just automatic. So one of the things we tell people is, hey, you can, keep this depending on your level of collectivity. You can keep this nice and pristine. If you're a collector, you can play straight off your laptop from the PDF, something like that, whatever might work. But if you have gamers who are trying to figure out and plan what they're going to do for Halloween night, this is a great option for them. And then we have a couple other items in that series too, from the DCC Horror series. We just reprinted #1, They Serve Brandel in Red. It's a great horror adventure. And then we just reprinted #4 as well, The Corpse That Love Built. So if your folks are looking for something Halloween, that's a good place to go. Now, one other thing we have in the works is our Judges screen has recently, or is close to selling out, not quite sold out, but we're reprinting it. I should talk a bit about that. Myself, but the art's amazing. This particular Judges screen has art, again, painted by Doug Kovacs, and it looks absolutely amazing. Anyway, but we have a new screen or new printing of the screen coming out. This is it right here, and I'm sure you know, but all the rage these days in GM screens is very thick, durable cardboard. And of course, this still looks thin on the camera, but this is actually thick, durable cardboard. It's substantially thicker than all the screens we've printed in the past, and as you can see, it doesn't warp or wobble at all. And so the latest printing, which will be coming your way in probably about 2, will have this more durable cardboard. That is a rundown of sort of current events for DC. Let me also cover how to get started if you're new to the line. So the core premise behind DCC from a retailer perspective is that we don't have nuclear escalation, so to speak. There's not a core book and then a player's book and then a DM's book, another player's book, then another player's book, then another DM's book. We don't follow that progression. There's one book and only one book. It's GMG 5070, which is the core rule book. It has been the same book since 2012 when it was first published. We've gone through reprints and we've corrected typos, and there's actually an adventure in the back that we've swapped out a couple of times, the new adventure, but the core rules are exactly the same, and there's literally been no changes to gameplay since then. So for you as a retailer, just stock that one book, and then you don't have to worry about it becoming obsolete. There's a new edition, there's a new splat book, that stuff doesn't apply. The way we support it is 2 ways. The first is we have adventure modules. So we have, I want to say something like 40 in print, but there's a huge availability of adventure modules, whether the DCC Horror that I just showed you, or many of the quote conventional DCC modules. But the other aspect of it is I spoke earlier about how we are big adherents of Appendix N. I mean, Appendix N really is some amazing fantasy literature. And if you're listening to this broadcast, you're probably a fan of fantasy literature. So I encourage you to Google appendix in and just read pretty much anything on the list. It's really terrific fiction and some of the greatest fantasy fiction published in the 20th century. But one of the things that we do at Goodman Games is we reach out to those authors and work with their estates to publish material based on them. So once you have the DCC core book, a second recommend suggest is the Dungeon Crawl Classics Lankmar box set and some of the associated Lankmar adventure modules. I'm sure some of you know Lankmar is a fantasy city. It was written by an author called Fritz Leiber. And Fritz Leiber is famous for many reasons, but among others, he created Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which are two more famous fantasy characters out there in the world. Fritz Leiber also coined the term sword and sorcery. He was the first person to ever write those words down in a letter he wrote to Amra, which is a fantasy zine long ago. And now, of course, we all know that term sword and sorcery, and it's, we drop that term all the time without realizing it was created by Fritz Leiber. But Goodman Games has a relationship with the estate of Fritz Leiber, and we published Dungeon Crawl Classics Lankmar, which is a box set and has, I think we're up to 11 adventure modules now supporting it, if my memory serves. And it's all set in that original city that he created, and you can interact with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and the Thieves Guild and the rest of the Sorcerers Guild, the rest of the amazing creations he had. It's a great way to take that DCC core book and expand it into that realm of fantasy literature that helps support it. Actually, while I'm here, I should also mention, we publish a fiction magazine called Tales of the Magician's Skull, which is a sword and sorcery fiction magazine. And in each issue, there are 6 or 7 stories, depending on word, and then in the back, an appendix that converts them to DCC stats. But part of the reason up is we just announced that issue number 6 of Tales from the Magician's Skull, which will come out in early to mid 2021, will actually feature all new Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser fiction, officially licensed by the estate of Fritz Leiber. This is the first fiction, it's called pastiche or sort of third-party fiction that, of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser that wasn't actually written by Fritz Leiber. It's the first to be published in, I want to say, like 20, 30 years, something like that. There have been 1 other stories ever authorized, but that's it. So it's a huge honor. But we'll soon be publishing the fiction that will then also turn later on be converted into games, and then it all comes together as part of this really cool ecosystem we have of inspiring fiction and gaming systems that are inspired by that fiction. Anyway, to circle back to my main point, which was if you want to get started, start with the core rulebook. I'd recommend the DCC Lankmar box set, a couple of those supporting adventure modules. And then we also have what's called Mutant Crawl Classics, which is a post-apocalyptic science fantasy expansion to DCC. The Mutant Crawl Classics core rulebook is standalone, so you don't need DCC at all. It is compatible with DCC. They actually run on very similar systems. You can easily drop one into the other. And the differences largely have to do with the genres as mechanics. So we take some of the same mechanics and kind of rename them from one system to the next. But they're fundamentally the same mechanics who are, invested in the gameplay and once they dive in. So a good place to start would be after the DCC core rulebook and the DCC Lankmar box set, the Mutant Crawl Classics core rulebook. And we have a number of adventures available for MCC as well, about a dozen or so as I recall. And it's a great place to have the characters start sort of world hopping or plane hopping from one setting to the next as they continue to grow and level and expand adventures. So that's an overview for you. I guess I don't really need to pause for questions because, oh, here we go. Any plans to translate into Spanish? Actually, yes, we actually have a licensee based in Spain, as opposed to Latin America, who actually has translated the DCC core book and a significant number of the expansions into Spanish. I have no idea how to get those to the hands of GTS, but I'm happy to connect them later on, and we can try to work that out. But they ship out of Spain, and they have sold quite a few in the Spanish market, and it's one of many languages that the book is available in.
It's definitely something we can talk about. Work with you on that to get more information on how to do that.
Cool. Okay. Let's see. What else do I want to ramble on about? I've covered DCC. Actually, I'll mention a couple other things just for you guys to talk up in your shops. I know many shops have dungeon masters who've created their own worlds, and they are, aspiring designers or writers. I should mention that we have 2 open calls going right now for new game content. One of them is for 5e, and it ends in, I want to say, 2 weeks. Ends pretty soon. So anybody interested should hop right on it. But if you go to the Goodman Games website and go to the right-hand side, you'll see a picture saying, I want you. and that Lich is recruiting for the 5e writing design submission contest right now. We're looking for writers as well as playtesters. We are expanding our 5e line quite a bit. So I showed you this. This is a good time to mention also. The next book in this line will be The Temple of Elemental Evil. So that one's not even solicited yet because I want to make sure I know what the final format will be before I try to take anybody's money. But it is huge. You know, the original Castle Amber adventure from TSR way back in the day was a skinny little module. It was 28 pages. Most of the modules we've converted have been relatively thin adventures. And once you convert them to 5e and add a bunch of new stats, they become big hardbacks. Temple of Elemental Evil was originally published at, I say 96 pages, maybe 70. It was a lot thicker than a lot of those earlier adventures. So we want to have the complete layout done before we have taken any money, because we want to make sure we know the final format. Or I think it will come out though, based on the 1e page count, is it will be 2 hardback volumes, and our plan is tentatively to release them in a slipcase. And that whole volume covers the same size as Castle Amber, plus the slipcase will be probably $99.99 MSRP. But once we have all the out done, confirm this for sure, we'll send in the solicitation. So I'm thinking probably late this early next year, we'll have all the details finalized. But Temple of Elemental Evil, I'm sure you all know, was one of the most popular D&D adventures of all time. It was one of the quirky ones because the TSR published The Village of Hamlet and then never really released what they had promised as a sequel until several years later when they released the complete compilation. But our version will have The Village of Hamlet. It will also have, or sorry, a scan of The Village of Hamlet, scan of Temple of Elemental Evil, then complete conversion of the entire adventure, as well as a lot of what I consider to be some of the things that really round out this series, which is interviews with the original creators and sort of trivia elements. For example, if you go back and look at Temple of Elemental Evil closely, review all the art in it, you'll see that almost every illustration is signed by the same name, which is Jack Fred. But Jack Fred never worked for TSR. And if you read the credits, you'll see none of the illustrations were credited. You know, there's no Jack Fred listed in the credits for Temple of Elemental Evil. So we went back and interviewed some Jeff Heasley and some of the original D&D crew from that day and asked them, you know, why in the world are these all signed by Jack Fred, even though Jack Fred credits? What's the deal there? So there's actually a great story behind that, which we'll tell in the interview there. There's many other interesting pieces too. For example, back in the mid 80s, TSR released a volume called AC5 Player Character Record Sheets, which seems like a pretty, you know, nobody thinks much. It's not like it's famous, right? Most people have never heard of this release. But if you look closely at the cover art, it actually looks a lot like what the cover art should have been for the module called T House, which was the sequel to Village of Hamlet that was never released. But if you look at that cover to AC5, you look at that and you think, wow, this really seems like it should be a cover painting of the Moat House as described in the Village of Hamlet. And based on the research we've done, we believe that painting was actually originally intended to be the cover to that sequel to Village of Hamlet, which was never released. So they recycled that cover art later on as a random player character record sheet cover. So we have a scan, a high-res scan of that original cover. And it was actually Clyde Caldwell's first published piece for TSR as well. Anyway, there's a lot of cool history that we've been able to uncover as part of this project, each one of these that we work on. And that next one, Temple of Elemental Evil, would be the number 6 in the series. So look for that. I mean, the actual book won't come out till middle of next year, so huge, but the solicitation should be available a little later from now. Let's see, and I actually have a hard stop soon because I have to run to something else. I think, are there any other questions I should answer or anything else I should cover? Scott, did I forget anything?
There's a comment there that that Manuel writes that we play all these at our store. We're currently in the Lost City and everyone loves them. We also sell them to new and old players. Yeah, there's really an appeal from the 5e community for that Reincarnated series where you've got older players who are like me, who remember buying these things as kids and have the chance to go back and play them again as adults using a new rule system and updated information, plus all the content that's really just kind of an homage or love letter to Dungeons and Dragons and its source material. So that the history part, the expansion part is all fantastic. It's great content, a great way to kind of introduce new players to classic Dungeons and Dragons style play, as well as relive it for those of us who are older, maybe grognards here. But they love the Reincarnated series and they encourage you to keep them up. So fantastic work there.
Awesome, thank you. And I should mention, one of the appeals of that series for me is it crosses generations of gamers. So as Scott mentioned, you often have the parents who remember the originals and they say, oh, this is awesome. And it's updated to 5e, just kids. This is my plan. I have an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old, and my 8-year-old is almost ready for D&D, I think within the next. So I'll be personally playtesting some of these in the year to come.
Great. Awesome. Any other questions? As Joe said, he does have a hard stop right now. So I will give, is info at Goodman Games the best way to get a hold of you, Joe?
Yeah, that's a perfect way.
Okay. So I'll put that in here if stores need to reach out personally. Otherwise, there you go. That's in there now. Okay. So feel free to contact Joe that way. Otherwise, Joe has a hard stop. He really kind of needs to get off, but we'll let you go. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Joe. We really appreciate it. Great content. The game is fantastic. I've played several times and really enjoyed Dungeon Crawl Classics as well as the D&D Reincarnated series. It's a lot of fun. Retailers, thank you again for attending, for being here live. Those of you on YouTube, again, feel free to click like and subscribe, and that'll get you information about future releases, future webinars coming up. And there is a webinar on Wednesday, so we'll have that all set up as well. We look forward to seeing most of you there again. So thank you all very much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Thanks, everybody. See you later.
Bye.